gift shop will be open. We have a special Christmas ornament that the Historical Society comes out with every year, a Wakulla County ornament, and you might pick up a few things there. And we have an author too, Diane Swearingen, will be there with copies of her books. Sammy Tedder is going to be playing the saxophone, so it'll be a great party. 1 to 4, Saturday, December 7th. Brent, will you introduce our very special speaker?
Thank you so much, Andrea. And it's a blessing to live in Wakulla County. We have such a rich history here, and a lot of people have heard about the fort at St. Mark's, and it's a very critical part of what makes Wakulla's history so special. And a lot of people have heard of the Wakulla Springs Park and how historically significant that is, and those are certainly a couple of the areas that set Wakulla apart. But not as many people are familiar with what I consider the third jewel in our crown of rich history of Wakulla, which is Hyde Park. So tonight we have a young man named Thomas Mitchell, and I emphasize young man because I went to Wakulla High School with Thomas here, so I have a self-interest in that youth proclamation. But we are excited to have him because Thomas has been to Washington, D.C. and currently in Gainesville, Florida, and has worked his whole life in research and in studying history and interpreting and sharing that and looking at records, preserving the record and that type of thing. So we're very fortunate to have him here tonight to come and talk to us about the land where his families lived in generations prior. Thomas, if you will come on up, and you can just take us right in for an hour or so and tell us some great things about this history. We appreciate you coming.
Good evening.
Good evening.
And I'm so very thankful to be here with the Wakulla County Historical Society. And also, this is my family ancestral homeland that I'd like to discuss about in the Hyde Park community. And I just briefly will mention that I have been researching this project for quite some time. In Washington, D.C., I started looking into the National Archives and getting various military records from my ancestors who lived in Hyde Park, who are now buried at the old Walker Cemetery, and now it's Thessalonial and
Hyde Park, St. Paul.
Hyde Park, St. Paul Cemetery. And we have been kind of collecting some things and studying how, the community itself established itself on the west bank of the Wakulla River. We're down at the lower bridge point, but it extends from that bridge all the way down to Wakulla Beach, which is now a wildlife refuge, in fact. But my ancestors have been there, and during the past COVID period, we were prepared to acknowledge and celebrate our 200th anniversary within that community of families who are still part of the Hyde Park family reunions. And there are a number of families that have been part. My mom's family are the Farmers. She and Effie Farmer, and actually she had like 9 siblings. I can't remember them all now, and they have been all over the United States. We've been in New York City, Washington, D.C., California, and Texas. And I have been connecting to those descendants in those locations, specifically through the Seminole Negro Freeman Foundation. And we have, even through our military records where I've been researching, we start with William Bush, who was listed as a mulatto scout, Seminole, in 1858, he mustered out. Well, he was recruited then, and then he mustered out in 1860 before the Civil War, but re-enlisted after the Civil War began, and he went down to down in South Florida. They were at this military base there, the Union base, which was one of the first U.S. colored troop bases that established during the Civil War. But William Bush records started me looking at, he actually was in the 2nd Florida Cavalry, and they were the last troops to take the last group of Seminoles out west to Kansas. Even though the earlier groups started going to Oklahoma and Arkansas. And those dates of removal from the county, Wakulla County itself, was somewhere around the period of the Indian Removal Act in 1834 through possibly when 1858, when the final group of resistance, and I'd like to always say that they were resisting the enslavement and protecting their ancestral homelands, which were theirs for centuries. And so I had been working with friends and working with this group out of Apalachicola called the North Florida African American History Project. And in fact, are their acronyms. And we have been doing a lot of research on the Negro Fort and how the Negro Fort, which is on the Apalachicola River, was the largest settlement of Seminole, Choctaw, Red Stick, and African Americans. Before 1816, they were at this fort, located at Prospect Bluff, and before that even, it was totally controlled by the early privateers that had been commissioned by the British and the Royal British Marines, who in fact set up their base at St. George Island and their land reconnaissance base up the Apalachicola River. Now there were some 3,000 settlers in this settlement as early as 1816. They were mustered out recruits who participated in the War of 1812 and the Battle of Bladensburg, also in other battles in Baltimore and so forth. And after they mustered out, they were given land in British West Florida territory. That boundary was said to be the Apalachicola River that separated the western Florida from East Florida. And it was totally controlled under the British at that time. It was, it didn't become a U.S. territory until around, I'm gonna say 1821, I think, is when it was first recognized as a U.S. territory. But the discrepancy is that the Seminoles resisted earlier than that. They were already in a campaign to destroy the Georgians who were trying to move to the Gulf of Mexico and trying to acquire the land all the way to the south, as far south as the Gulf of Mexico. And specifically, our family, around the time that this permanent settlement already existed, it was a fishing village, it was a Seminole village of, let me just say, Christian baptizing native people who had begun in the Spanish era, baptizing and accepting the Seminole slaves or runaway slaves. There's no distinction of slaves, Native Americans being enslaved and Black Americans. There is no distinction. We were all of the same tribal community in Spanish Florida, and we had already accepted Christianity in a way in the St. Mark's area by the mid-1650s. We were already Christianized and part of the Spanish realm long before we became part of the American U.S. system and still occupying the west bank of the Wakulla River. My ancestors specifically, even through my research, come from Jackson County, and they became farmers after the first capitulation with the U.S. government after the war in 1818. And so we adopted and started being called farmers, but we still maintained our fishing village and practices right there along the Wakulla River and all the way down to what is now called the Wakulla Beach. My grandmother and grandparents who raised my mother were Obadiah and Ethel Triplett. And I always like to refer to everyone that as a young kid, when I would come down here, 5 and 6 years old, you know, my parents would like bring me for their summers. And I always heard Obadiah say that there were no white people ever living there. And I mean, there have been no white people there. This was like 60s, 1 through 64, you know, during that period. And he was adamant that, hey, this land has always been our property, the properties of our descendants for generations then. He was going back 5 and 6 generations on that homeland site. Since then, I have done a little further research on that site, and I worked with a member from the U.S. Forestry Service, Jeffrey Shanks, and they had just started doing ground penetrating and things of them. They found a mound, a burial mound from the native indigenous folks there, and they were the Kakara people. Once they started calling it the Wakulla River, it was really the Kakara River, and these folks were fishermen and maritime people. My grandfather Obadiah, I don't think he graduated from a normal high school, but he had a sense of being able to read the stars when he fished at night. He had a sense that he could show you the property boundaries only at night by the celestial line to know exactly where their properties are. Today, my brother and I are looking to do a couple of modern surveys of the property, as well as getting an aerial drone site so that we can, for our community records, for our history records, show the initial trails that are, or that were used by family members up until the 1940s, and then they started building roads, and changing the road landscape in that area. It just so happens that our property that I had just inherited, my brother and I have been doing a lot of research on the geopolitical presence of these native people, my ancestors, who actually had signed treaties with the Spanish, the French, as well as the British before 1800. By 1802, they had signed the Spanish agreement at St. Mark's, and history makes us think that there are other people who signed it, but these are my descendants who signed those treaties. And most of them, even before the advance of the Red Stick village that was pre-Hyde Park, we were there and welcoming runaway slaves into that community from Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and even as far west as Louisiana. We found the names well, through my research, there are Powells who lived in that community, and that was an assumed name that Osceola carried under the Powell family name. And he was supposedly born in Tallahassee, Alabama, you know, and we've gone there and we've checked out those areas, and we see how close, you know, and how the migrant pattern began, being forced from the west area, the Horseshoe Bend battle, and forced here into the Apalachicola region along the Apalachicola River. Now, I've been told that there are settlements that existed from Chief Blunt in the Bluntstown area all the way down to present-day Apalachicola that were free Seminole habitats. I'll just call it habitats, but they were villages that eventually were warred upon or removed from actually claimed. And then at that point, they started reclassifying the Spanish mulattoes into the Negro. And the Negroes were all part of the tribal family. There was no distinction. And one of the big things was before we began farming, we were already a sustainable fishing village. We were also had the freshwater control of the Wakulla River and Wakulla Springs. And at some time, that became ambiguous, and they claimed that we were living on abandoned lands. And yet, the community of Hyde Park never abandoned itself. I look at it as one of Wakulla County's earliest and longest continual communities in this county from St. Mark's era, from the period when they were trading at the fort in St. Mark's, coming up the Wakulla River with goods, including, of course, the early fishing was great, and we were feeding folks there, and that was a trading center. There also was a mission there, and they were practicing Christianizing and allowing the natives of that community on the Wakulla River to start and educate them in whatever the, I would say, the Spanish saw fit to adopt them as Spanish citizens. So with that, I'd like to say that we've always been geopolitical participants in this system. America having been founded under the constitutional realm, we realize that we have been there since there was the start of the Continental Congress, which predates the Revolutionary period. And the Continental Congress was established, and they declared war against the British and for this revolution of the 13 colonies, excuse me. Those colonies had set up this Continental Congress in order to give indigenous and native communities a chance to participate in the forming of America. While researching it, the indigenous people had already started unifying themselves against the sale of land and sale of property. It happened that the last chairperson of the Continental Congress was a Native American from Georgia by the name of Van. His last name was Van, Joe Van, John Van, I'm not sure. But he, after Maryland's head of the Continental Congress was deposed or not reelected, they decided to allow this native person to become the head of the Continental Congress, and from there, the U.S. decided they were going to start and create a new continental organization, but based on the Philadelphia Constitution. Excuse me. And this Constitution eliminated Native Americans and Black people from its initial establishment. It allowed for Blacks to be slaves in perpetuity. And Florida, by this time, was already a free, mixed culture. From St. Augustine all the way to Frenchtown, which was established here before Tallahassee. And the Frenchtown and its residents actually came out of the Battle of Yorktown with Lafayette. When the troops were surrendered, the British, African-American maritime, or the British Marines, they were imprisoned, and it was the job of Lafayette to take them across the border away from the southern Georgia border. And this is how they were supposed to be imprisoned. And they selected Frenchtown, and they were given a tract of land through Lafayette. The Lafayette land was actually filed and put in place by James Lafayette, because they took Lafayette back to France. The, I want to say, Napoleonic organization in France made it so that no military person could receive, if they were a mercenary in any war, they could not accept land and in a foreign country. And so all of that transaction ended up coming through James Lafayette, who was his footman and slave, or he didn't consider him his slave, because James Lafayette actually was a spy who worked for Cornwallis and was reporting it to Lafayette. So after the Revolutionary War, after the surrender at Yorktown, when they left out of Virginia, they brought these people to British West Florida, and they were given muster documentation of their land along the Apalachicola River, all the way to the Wakulla River. And it was not called the Wakulla River, but they used that boundary as the prime meridian boundary. And as a prime meridian boundary, I happen to be researching when I went to high school here, and my Uncle Joe Farmer, and also one of our close relatives and elders of the community was Richard Creech. Now, I understand that his name Creech, was, the spelling of it was different, and he could have been Richard the Creek, in many of that period. But his home site and land is still part of this Hyde Park community, and we have families like the Hawkins, the Triplets, the Farmers, the Donaldsons, the Harveys even, for that matter. My uncle was married into the Harvey family, and the Triplets. We have all intermarried over the past 2 centuries and stayed pretty much here in Wakulla County, but many of our family members have lived in Ohio. They've lived in, and are still there in Ohio. They came out of the community, and they may have settled in the late 19th century up there in the Ohio region. We know for a fact that even as far as where Chicago is, Chicago had been found by a Frenchman, or actually a Haitian, by the name of Dusable. And the records show that he is from St. Mark's, Haiti. But he participated in the Seminole War, and he was given that muster agreement after he got out to the lands up in Chicago, where he started a trading post, married a native woman, and they operated and are now recognized as the founder of the Chicago community. And all this is during the onset of the Seminole War in Florida, which the British financed. They also provided military weaponry. Armbruster and Abernoth, who were eventually executed at the fort in St. Mark's, along with Francis the Prophet. Francis the Prophet was the Red Stick leader, and he had fought at Horseshoe Bend and on the Apalachicola at the Negro Fort, where they began the tactic of removing women and children and using military tactics of leaving no one behind. And so when they said there was this massive massacre at Prospect Bluff, where everyone was wiped out, they resettled on the Wakulla River. They came from the Apalachicola River to the Wakulla River, and they also, this is where the Hyde Park name came from. All the way at that period, they even made a journey, Chief Francis and other, they took a delegation to England, and they went in front of the Court of Baths in England, and this is where Edward Nichols comes into getting the permission from the Chiefs Council to build this fort on the Apalachicola River. It was not called the Negro Fort. The Negro Fort name kind of was I want to say a derogatory name for Prospect Bluff. But it was one of the main trading centers, along with St. George Island, for exporting furs, pelts, not to mention oysters and other necessities that were not actually in Europe at the time. So we found, and I've been looking for the connections between names such as the Pygotts, who also were sympathetic and British allied. They were allied with the British. Of course, the name Nichols is a very important name that we are researching to see how far that alliance went, even after Edward Nichols returned to Europe. He became an admiral, and he was also given a duty after leaving Florida. He was like the provost post commander in I'm trying to think of the name of the island, right off the west coast of Africa, Cape Verde. And he began documenting and providing the Africans who were coming into the New World, into modern Boston and areas like that, passports, credentials, papers, and he started that at the Negro Fort for those natives there. And they recruited a number of Haitian mercenaries to fight with them and the Seminole cause of protecting that northern border of Florida from encroachment by Georgians and the so-called U.S. government at that time, which was really Jacksonian government that he made himself governor of Florida, and Washington had been burned, and there was no Congress in Washington. They started meeting far up in New York. I want to say at Yale University or something like that, under Adams. But all of this is to say that the Florida resistant movement of free blacks in North Florida has been a consistent one for the past 200 years. Even though we've had to, there were attacks on plantations, and they were freeing the blacks who were enslaved there, and a lot of them had already intermarried within the tribe while still being slaves in Georgia. And they would come here and continue this duplicitous persona as slaves, and yet they were doing a lot of technical and reconnaissance of how to free these slaves and bring them back into Florida. And it has been, even since the town of Miccosukee, we found, on Lake Miccosukee, that that was one of the larger villages at the time too. But Frenchtown, San Luis Obispo, and St. Mark's were pretty much the Spanish and French or alliances against the United States. They allied themselves with these Native Americans who were people of color. Without a doubt, people of color. Not the Midwestern version that we watch on TV, but we were Afro-Caribbean descendants, Tiano Indian descendants, the Calusa, and I'm trying to remember what else they called them, that now all the archaeologists are trying to portray them as Midwestern Native people. Instead, they were really people of color like myself, like my cousin Bossy and my other family members. They were the indigenous people of Florida. And that's one of the things I'd like us to acknowledge more during Indigenous Peoples Week and our community in St. Mark's and in Hyde Park specifically, how we can start working with the Wakulla County Historical Society to provide more of a narrative that includes these people who are still amongst us here. We've just, like I said, been reclassified. We've moved into this whole modern civil rights era since Dr. King. And even Dr. King has a very, very interesting, his wife Coretta, we found, they are from Eufaula, Alabama. And Eufaula, Alabama people came also into Florida, and they went back and they took the land, and the Mulatto King was the signer of the Seminole Treaty. He was known as the Mulatto King, but prior to him, there was the Black King, who was the Mulatto King's father, and his name was Filatucci. Filatucci was a pirate. He was one of the right-hand men of William Augustus Bowles, and he made the trek across the ocean in the late 1790s to meet with the British heads of state. They literally established their embassy in, I want to say around 1794, 1795, when William Augustus Bowles traveled there, and they couldn't get an audience through the House of Commons, so they ended up going to the Court of Baths, which was a military order, and they agreed to sign and allow them to build the first British fort in Florida, on the Apalachicola River. So that significant documentation gives us, at least my family members and my research, a lot of substantiated diplomatic energy. You know, we were involved in diplomacy with every European nation that attempted to come into the Gulf of Mexico between St. George Island and the St. Mark's River. And water was indeed as invaluable then for maritime shipping and trading as was, you know, if you came up that Gulf of Mexico and ended up at the far northern point, they were already out of it. It was a mistake, a nautical mistake. They thought they might have been in the Atlantic Ocean. So they had to, you know, get water, get refueled and supplies. And the native people did that without it being a battle or anything. They did that solely to keep them off of their shores. At that time, they were using boats and flat boats that were over 40 feet long that they could ride out to the ships. And it took those ships a negotiated settlement in order for them to build forts and come up from the Gulf and start providing land claims for their countries. So one of the other things that about our community of Hyde Park, that it goes back, I've seen registered documentation that says that at one time was a part of the French Louisiana, what do they call it, parish system. That it was a part of the parish system. It was considered a parish at one time on the west bank of the Wakulla River. That later became, like, they went to Shell Point and made that the regional, I don't want to call it head of state, but the regional registry for anyone coming into this area. It was with the French after Spanish had given it up. But the fort of St. Mark's was conquered by the natives, and the Spaniards were run off from that fort. And they maintained that fort all the way up until Andrew Jackson came there and hung Chief Francis. They also hung 2 other members who signed and were delegates that went to Europe, went to England. And they executed them intentionally. So this information would never really come to fruition, and that they could start enslaving these people as they came from Georgia and into this area. Enslavement was what they did as a humanity instead of massacring them, these tribal villages, they would enslave them. And that's how that became. Many of those blacks there who had already ran from bondage refused to be enslaved again. They would fight to the death. This is what the thrust of the Seminole War was. The Seminole fighters were mainly the blacks of the tribe, where they confronted the Americans, the United States, Andrew Jackson, and they then allowed their families to go further south to Angola, a place called Angola near Tampa. They called it Angola. And it's a settlement site that is recently being rediscovered. The University of Central Florida and Gainesville has done a lot of archaeology understanding, and they now connect it to the Royal British Marines at Negro Fort on the Apalachicola. So I've read a couple of books. Dale Cox specifically has done a lot of research, and he has his narrative of what took place at the Negro Fort. And I do believe that the society did include many whites, even as the Seminole War broke out. There were white sympathizers who weren't plantation owners, who certainly followed into Wakulla County what is present-day Wakulla County, and settled here. And so, you know, there is a number of things in Hyde Park specifically that I have found on my property border. Actually, the northwest border of my property happens to have a U.S. territorial marker on it. As well, beside the U.S. territorial marker, there's another obelisk kind of a marker that I haven't had anyone look at and determine what it is, but it does have British West Florida. It's like Be Up Brit West Florida on this obelisk. And then right next to it is the smaller marker that says U.S. territory. And unfortunately, I don't remember if there was a date on it, but my Uncle Joe showed me these markers when I was like in the 10th grade. And he says, hey, this is where our property starts, your mom's property is here, and my property goes over here. And he was able to only give those land descriptions at night using his Cardassial training as a native Seminole. There was no one else came here to teach us that. And I actually had been through a couple of Seminole council meetings, and they explained to me that the Berbers came to Florida, Berbers, and they taught them how to circumnavigate the Gulf, how to circumnavigate even around the Atlantic coast. And this is where the turbans come from that the Seminole chiefs wear. Not there's a narrative that, hey, they robbed a group of actors or something that came into Florida and they stole all their clothes and that's why they wore these turbans, but no. And I have been to, just last year, to Eagle Pass, Nacimiento, Texas, where they have over 2,000 people that are descendants of the Florida Seminole living in those areas, right on the border. And John Horse, who was a Florida Seminole, went to Mexico City, and when they gave him the northernmost landscape, the Mexican government, for them to protect against the U.S. trying to come into Florida. And this is around the town of Del Rio, Texas, around Del Rio, Texas. So, and John Horse actually came back to Florida 3 times as a U.S. scout. And he had been run out of Oklahoma because the Creeks in Oklahoma re-engaged in selling slaves to the Sooners, who were coming, getting land and whatever, and needed cheap labor. So that forced them down into Del Rio, Texas, and the Mexican government has those treaties that are available, and they can connect to St. Mark's and its treaties as part of the Spanish-Mexican continent at that time, you know, where it went from the 13 colonies were here, and all the rest of America was pretty much Spain. And Spanish, more they called it Mexico and so forth. So I have had a lot of time to go down there and look at stuff, and we are trying to connect and bring those families back to our community in Hyde Park so that they can reconnect with our families and our family reunions and understand that this connection is still here and we are still First Nations people. First Nations people. And those nations have been, as we all know, politically reestablished based on, you know, our current political situations now, Republicans and Democrats. But we know, and I know from one of the grants that William Bush received, they were free soilers. After he returned from Kansas with the Florida 2nd platoon, or, they went up there to fight around, I guess that was, John Brown and the resistance in Kansas. And they went up there, but the Free Soilers became, their motto was free land for free people. And the Free Soilers actually came out of Illinois, where Abraham Lincoln came out of. Morrill, this guy named Morrill, was one of the heads of the Free Soiler Party. And their thing was, once emancipated, they should have land. And and many of the blacks who registered for the first time, who were U.S. colored troops, were signed under the Free Soilers Party. But our family in Hyde Park, actually, after the Reconstruction period started, were involved with the Constitutional Congress of Florida, reconstituting the Florida post-Civil War Constitution. And our ancestor, Amos Hargett, was one of the few and first to sign off on that, and to sign off on the Constitutional Congress that was held. And I've heard a story or two that they tried to move it away so that we'd miss it, so that he wouldn't be a part of that Constitutional Congress. But Florida, unfortunately, after the Civil War, still is in the Confederate state of mind, and many of them just did not participate in that, I want to say it was 1867 or something like 1868 election. They really refused to even participate because they were not they still rose the Confederate flag and still stood under it. So we understand that it has been, my family, I say we, my family, has had to move and come back and, retain the land and retain things. And so my organization that I'm representing in Gainesville, I'm co-founder of, is called the Seminole Freeman Foundation. And our goal at the Seminole Freeman Foundation is to work with community organizations such as the Hyde Park historical groups and other communities like in Buckhorn and in Bluntstown and in Apalachicola to find, and we want to really start a reclamation movement, reclaiming these lands that were capitulated but not surrendered. And now they're supposed to be under the federal protection of the Interior and Forest Service and other things. But we just need to have more clarity for them to understand this land was not surrendered. The people here still have a claim over these lands that are mainly national forests and parks. But we want to get a stewardship project. Specifically, I want to get the Hyde Park Community Legacy Trail that is going along the path where they just put the new bicycle trail in that community, from my property border down to the lower bridge. We want that to be named the Hyde Park Community Legacy Trail. And we want to put signage on it that tells the collective history of the community over the last 200 years. Just so, and as the people ride the bike paths or whatever, they can stop and read and learn more about the community. We also feel it's necessary that we protect the estuaries and have stewardship over our waterways and estuaries along the Wakulla River. It's important to us as a people, as a family, as indigenous native people to Wakulla County and to America. So I'm involved myself with a group out of Washington called the National Congress of Black American Indians, and its affiliates are all over the country in every tribe, and we're trying to, just bring it back. We want them to come. I'm planning on something in 25 or 26 at Wakulla Springs, so we can at least do an ancestral gathering and try to bring, you know, some healing to us all, because now in the 21st century, we know the atrocities that took place, everyone. And so we just want to make sure that the new healing movement is based on our love for our neighbors, based on wanting to share our history and why we're here and why we aren't subservient people, and how we managed to, you know, keep our faith, our churches, our religion, and everything. There's so much. We have connections in Ocala, in Tampa, all the way down in South Florida, in Miami, and they all stem from this Hyde Park community. So I just wanted to thank everybody. I don't know if I used up my time, but if you have any questions or anything.
So one time you explained to me how the name Farmer came about.
Yes.
Would you like to tell us?
Yes. Well, the farmers, actually, the name Farmer was adopted by the indigenous native people on the west bank of the Wakulla River, who were fishers, gatherers, and hunters. And they did not give their weapons up, but they were not going to war against the US government anymore, and they were going to become farmers. And the leader of this was Hawkins, a man by the name of, what was Hawkins' first name? I can't remember his first name. Benjamin Hawkins, absolutely. Benjamin Hawkins came into what is now Hyde Park, in that community area, and he started as a co-ambassador or whatever with George Washington in the first administration, and was assigned from Georgia to come to the Gulf and offer the native people farming utensils, mules, things of that nature, which they decided they would. And my family, particularly Josiah Farmer, who came out of Greene County, Georgia, which is up there where UGA is, I believe, isn't that? But they were first to come in and settle during that period, and they became farmers. Josiah Farmer, and many people, that name Josiah holds some type of reverence, because Chief Francis, who was executed at Fort St. Mark's, he was a Josiah. He was a Josiah. And so they kind of gave that name, like Obadiah. I read that the Seminoles, when the young chiefs were chosen, they were called Obadiah, and they were given to the matriarchs of the tribe to raise to be a chief. And my ancestor, Obadiah Triplet, I think we can connect his name to that, you know, that tradition. Mm-hmm.
So to continue, if I understand this right,
Mm-hmm.
so after the American Revolution, we became Spanish Florida again. But then you're saying that Benjamin Hawkins, who was the U.S. Indian agent
Exactly.
in today's Roberta, Georgia, right? He
Yes.
is that near the Flint River up there.
Hawkinsville, Georgia area, I think they call that now.
Anyway, so are you saying he actually came down here into Spanish Florida?
Yes, yes. Yes, I'm saying it was his charge. It was let's say it was a covert operations of the first administration.
So the people who would have helped him would have been the Kennards, who lived near today's Albany, Georgia, not far from where
There's
that.
cow pens and
And they had plantations, the Spanish call them rancheros,
Mhm.
on the Wakulla River
Yes,
and Wakulla Springs.
yes. As a matter of fact, the ranchero, we were here with haciendas.
Mhm.
When the first few haciendas were built on the west bank of the Wakulla River, we were already there, and we were integrating within the Spanish population. And we show on records that by 1816, they were listed, my ancestors on the Wakulla were listed as mulatto.
Yeah.
Mulatto. And then in the US military records, the same ancestor is listed as a Seminole scout.
Have you had your DNA done?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have. And my mother's, the farmer's side, the mitochondrial DNA states that in my mother's family, that they are 49% Indo-European, which could be Portuguese, Spanish, or even Turkish. And that those bloodlines have characteristic traits, and they are marked on that DNA as regions where we would have possible ancestors and family. And it's interesting that I listed, it came back that I was a Negro from Florida, but didn't have any Native American blood.
Luck in the draw.
Yes, but at that time, they hadn't started getting the haplogroups right yet. This was, I did that like 20 years ago, and National Geographic did my DNA back then. So, I think I could probably do one now, or take a new, and it would probably be even more succinct. But I told my mother this before she passed, and she was determined to tell me, oh, we don't have any Indo-European. They don't know what they're talking about. Because my grandmother, my mother, all married black men. They all have been, traditionally, all my aunts, except one or two married whites. But they are predominantly of that genotype that I did. My mother refused to take it after I told her what mine came back. She was like, oh no, that can't be right. We don't have any European. I said, well, this is going back about 300 years or more, not just your recent history. But it has been used over and over again. Actually, at Howard University, where I attended, I have been able to use my DNA with the researcher who does the program on PBS, Skipper Gates. And I never saw anything come back from him, but at that time he was determined to say that there were no black Indians. When he first started doing his Find Your Roots series. So, but and Dr. Higginbottom is one of the earlier researchers at Howard University who says, oh, don't give up, you keep, they kept my DNA for some years, and then they sent the CD-ROM, and then they sent it back to me, with a long letter, hey, your family in Florida should be proud, and you should really pursue anything you can find further. But they said to me that those were probably the first Native Americans to mix bloods with Europeans, period. That early on the DNA in Florida. So, I don't know where else it can go from there. But yep, well, thank you. Are there any more questions? Anyone want to ask?
I would just say, when I started learning about the trading post over there in the Wakulla River, one of the questions I had in my mind was, why would the Scottish traders that left the Carolinas to get away from the Revolutionary War and all that, why would they have built a trading post up the river in this random spot? And then later on, I came to realize there's already a community there, and so it was a perfect spot. It's like they built a Walmart where they got customers.
There's a large Native community in existence there, and not only that, Panton and Leslie, they were the traders that put the trading post on the Wakulla River, but ended up inside the fort on the Apalachicola. And Edward Nichols did a hearing. And in trial, and I've gotta find them in the records of the British, colonies. They listed, and they made Panton and Leslie return 1 million acres that they had stolen from the native people, where they were just trading pots and pans, and the natives really weren't aware that Panton and Leslie did this. So they had to move that trading post inside the fort walls in Apalachicola at the Negro Fort. Go ahead.
At that fort.
Yes.
So the one at St. Mark's, I'm a historian, so I've done a lot of research on this,
Yes.
second Spanish period right here. So when you're saying about the trading posts on the Wacala River, which, is, where the lower bridge is, about less than half a mile on the left-hand side, it would have been there.
Yes.
But that trading post in 1783 was established because just before the British governor, Tony, left St. Augustine, there were 1,200 native people that came to St. Augustine at the end of the American Revolution, when the Spanish were going to take over again. They came down there as far away from the Great Lakes and wondered where they would get their stuff from. So it's like, where's Walmart gonna go, right? But Tonin said, well, we're all, they were all gonna leave, but Panton was allowed, with the permission of the Spanish, to open the trading post at the fort, which was gonna be rebuilt a little bit later. And then they put the trading post, well, that was then like a warehouse by the fort. And they put the trading post up on the river. And the first one, well, there's a whole story there about how it was looted. That's a whole other thing.
But let this be a lesson, if any of you want a trading post, don't go overcharging the because they might show up and show out.
Well, and indeed, that's what happened. And let me just say that before Andrew Jackson came into Pensacola, and the British government had agreed to return to those chiefs their land, over 1 million acres, which is the Apalachicola National Forest, from Apalachicola River to Wacala River. And that was supposed to go back, and there would be a total armistice between the natives and the British government and in British West Florida. And that's how the alliance of the Seminole Nation actually became trading in weapons and other items that Panton and Leslie really did not. They gave them cookware
They gave them
plows.
They gave them lots and lots of weapons.
Well, the British.
They came in up
Yes.
the Wacala River all the way up to Albany, Georgia, because this is a really interesting little side bit here. When Thomas Jefferson decided that they needed to make money, the new country needed a lot of money, so Thomas Jefferson decided, well, any river that emanates within the United States of America, we have a right, like the Mississippi, we have a right of navigation into the Gulf of Mexico to sell our goods. Guess what did not emanate in the United States? Wacala Springs.
River.
So Wacala Springs was the perfect place to bring weapons in, and then they also exported cattle, they exported all sorts of honey,
Yes.
tallow. They didn't have any more deer skins, so they exported cowhide. But they were able to transport these weapons all at,
Yes,
muskets, balls, powder.
they had armories and armaments.
They could go right into what was still Creek territory, wasn't Georgian, and there was no border, right? The 31st parallel was supposed to be the border, but how do you know? There was no wall. They just went up there.
Yes, and they
Distributed
had no
all these
longitude.
weapons.
They only used latitude up until the early 19th century, I think after 1805, the French were the only ones using the latitude and longitudinal precision to map and make cartographies of the lands. And as a matter of fact, that's the same reason why George Washington decided to get L'Enfant to design the city of Washington, D.C., because they knew that only the British were still using these,
Trains.
yeah, they were using the sun and the sextet, which was really a marine visual measure. And they hadn't quite gotten to France, where the French at the Sorbonne had already started awarding, scientists how to figure out this latitudinal circumference markers of how to navigate the seas. And it's interesting too that the Seminole tribes, the Muskogee Creek, they actually their embassy was known as the Cherokee and Creek, the United Nations of Cherokee and Creek. And that was the first time they even used the United Nations as a title for a community here in North America, because they were able, once they got the use of latitudinal and longitudinal, they were able to go all the way up into Canada, literally, and survey and mark and map. And I want to also mention the story of the brother of Tecumseh. He traveled from what was at that time considered, I guess, Michigan, the Michigan region, and he came all the way down to Eufaula, Alabama, where they had the first major chiefs gathering. And this gathering was to, again, say that anyone who sold land would be, any chief who sold his land would be executed. And Tecumseh then named Chief Francis, Josiah Francis, the prophet. He was given the name the prophet, and he was given, the War Council gave him the right to fend off any encroachment on the sacred lands here in Florida, Alabama, the mounds, all throughout the areas there. They were going to resist the sales of those lands.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, I really appreciate it.